just discovered it twice.
Coming out is episode of the week.
Thank you all so much for joining us here for the second solo exhibition of Isabelle Young's work, the very exciting young photographer. And we're here to talk about her practice, her influences, her work. And I've known Isabelle for a number of years now.
Yeah, quite a few.
And I really do connect with her work and find it so interesting, and there are so many layers, and so we will have a discussion about that and share that. And just to say, my name is Brandei again, and I recently left Sotheby's. I was the head of photographs there. And so that's my background, that I come from 20 years experience of photographs, and again, I'm very excited about Isabelle's work and happy to share it all with you. So, where to start? I think if we can say that you recently graduated from the RCA.
Yeah.
And as I said before, this is your second exhibition with Fabian Lang, who is a gallerist in Zurich. And your first show was there with him in Zurich.
Yeah, so this time last year, had my first solo show with him, and then graduated afterwards, so it's quite a busy June. But it was great, and I was at the RCA, I started there in 2019, so I was there throughout COVID. So I actually ended up being there for 3 years. I took a year out, and then I spent the autumn term of the MA in Venice doing a project which became my degree show. So a couple of these works are from that time, actually. Venice tends to creep into every series I do now. It's sort of inevitable.
And you had spent a lot of time in Venice,
Yeah.
even in years prior
Yeah,
to...
yeah. I sort of spent time kind of working there, and just because it was, you know, so part of what I was interested in. And I was working there in 2018 during what was at the time a historic flood. So the series I did for my degree show was about this historic endeavour to protect the city and keep it safe. So I spent a lot of time exploring all the remote islands and all, so now I'm having a kind of break from the lagoon.
And as I'm sure you all have had a good look around, and these are architectural works, interiors, exteriors.
Yeah.
There are no people in the works, but we'll get to that later. But prior to your photography degree, you studied literature.
Yeah. So I didn't. So that's the
English literature.
English literature. So my MA was the first time I'd actually formally studied photography since school. I went to Camden in London when we had a darkroom. So my introduction to photography was shooting on film and processing it myself and printing it myself, which was so important. And I only shoot film to this day. But just that process of coming out of the darkroom with your prints. I always think of it like lifting fish out of water, and then you go into the light and you see it for the first time. It's just so magical. So yeah, that was a really good grounding. And at the age as well, I had a book. I had a book by Eugene Auger, the French photographer who photographed Paris, who was commissioned by the French government to document Paris before most of it was demolished. But he shot it in such a poetic, beautiful way, and I feel like a lot of those locations are kind of imprinted onto my camera, or just those compositions of mystery and strangeness and
just to place his period for people that don't know, Angers, 19th century. So at the beginning of photography and the
documentary photography, more, less formal.
And again, street.
Abandoned, no people.
Buildings, no people.
Yeah, that sense of something that's about to disappear. It's just so. And I remember going to the Met when I was like 17 and seeing his work in person there, and it being kind of life-changing. Sort of hated New York, but loved going. This work made the whole trip kind of. It was Christmas. It was freezing. I was miserable, but I just remember seeing his work in the museum, and just it was made it all worth it. That was then I went on to study English, and it was interesting during lockdown because we were writing our dissertations in year one of the MA. I got back all my uni notes out. I got back all my books and everything that I'd done on my BA, and realised how much I needed to bring all that actually back into my work now. Because I love literature with a very unreliable narrator, like Lolita and Atonement. They're really key to me, and like that idea which I talk about with this series of suspending your disbelief. And a playwright, a novelist, a cinema director, they ask you to suspend your disbelief when you watch something, and you're kind of guided by someone whose sight is your sight is so dependent on them. And I suddenly realised, literature, the novel and photography, they're all about time and point of view. Those two things are so key in both of them, like who saw what and when they saw it.
Yeah.
And Atonement is my favourite novel just because it's so devastating how the narrator lies to you, and at the end you realise that this novel is her atonement, and she's sort of saying, you know, there's no atonement for God, and there's a limit to what we see.
Yeah.
So that again was also interesting, that the limit of sight in literature and how that extends to photography as well.
Totally, and how I have to remind myself daily not to believe every photograph I see, that
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah,
necessarily true,
Yeah.
that it is a constructed
Yeah.
version of reality or fiction, depending on the author, and how important it is to have that agency.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good point to bring in, that you are half Italian
Yeah. Yeah.
and have spent a lot of time in Italy, and we share a love of neorealism, film, and that era. And we've talked a lot about, and I can see it in your work, this film set, these sort of these snapshots, these very very
Narrow
tight,
kind of,
narrow compositions, which are so prevalent in neorealism films.
Yeah, and it's I think again that idea of sort of sight as well, because I shoot on film, I don't know what I'm doing when I'm doing it, and I love that process. I can't. So when I come home from shooting, you know, going to Italy for me is important. I don't shoot here. I don't see London. I can't see London. I've lived here my whole life, so I am quite driven by that curiosity of being a stranger in a place, and my intuition of somewhere new, and just seeing what I shoot. So that is really key. But it's also with this body of work. This body of work has so many beginnings. It's hard to kind of pinpoint one, but one of them was going to Los Angeles, spending a whole summer there in 2017. I have a family friend who lives there, and her husband actually works in the film industry as a set designer, and being immersed in that world and seeing all that architecture that is so desperate to have a European history and is such a pastiche of Europe. I found it kind of disappointing and embarrassing, but fascinating. It was just so, because LA has a history, it has its own history, but it wants sort of ours, and it's, and then, you know, you're going to these museums, and then down the studios, there's Paramount Studios, so it's all going on around you, and I love that.
And that replication of these European street scenes as film sets.
Yeah, like Venice, Venice Beach area, you know, and Grand Canal and stuff. It was fascinating.
And I think when I look around, these are very timeless. They could have been shot in the 30s or 40s or 50s, or now. There's an element of that suspended time.
Yeah, and I think film massively gives the work that, you know, it's sort of those pictures we look at by people we admire, or just our grandparents, they look like the films that they shot as well, and that aesthetic. But it's also, you know, to bring it back to cinema, so this series was also really inspired by Italian neorealism, which came out of the First and Second World Wars, and was so tied to Mussolini, because he established one of the most famous film studios in the world called Cinecittà in Rome, which, you know, Martin Scorsese has since filmed at, and lots of contemporary film directors. But at the time, it was founded to make propaganda films, because he realised it was the best way to get the world out to the masses of what his regime wanted to do. And then one of his ministers founded the Venice Film Festival as well, and there was a Mussolini Award for many years. So it's so tied up with cinema, that era.
And then, however, so many of the neorealist directors and producers wanted to be out of that studio, because they were not supportive of the politics, and went to the street.
Exactly. So yeah, they shot on the street. They shot in a very recently bombed out city. They were shooting as the war had just ended, so it was so immediate. They had no money for, you know, cast, sets, production. Their sets were the cities, and
the cities were therefore the protagonists as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking of architecture with this series in that way, as sort of bearing witness, or, you know, street casting. Like I don't make sets, I don't arrange things. I'm very much like I shoot what I find in that, I guess, in that kind of near-realist set. I'm using these locations as in that manner.
But you do purposely go with an agenda.
I research heavily, massively research.
So you're not sort of wandering aimlessly and finding. You go, you plan, you do your homework, and go with a vision in mind.
Yeah, and I was watching an interview with some writers from South Park that we're giving a lecture to some writing students yesterday. It was just so random. I just watched it on Twitter. But he was saying, you know, as a writer, you can't wander. You need a structure. And within that structure, things happen. I was like, that really resonated with me. Like I have, you know, when I'm not shooting, I'm researching, I'm planning, I'm on Street View. But then I allow myself to wander when I get there. And it's often the pictures that I didn't plan or the locations I didn't plan that end up being my favorites.
But it's funny because although there are, so you've mentioned LA, we've got Venice here, we've got Torino, I think, here.
Ooh, no.
Or no, not in this.
No, I don't
show.
think, no. And Modena, which is
Modena.
car industry, and then Los Angeles, yeah.
So different places, but
Yeah.
to me they feel like they could be all the same place.
Yeah, well, I guess there is that continuity in my work of like a palette. I always think of having a palette in kind of a painterly sense. I'm always looking at similar colours that kind of unite each other. I mean, yeah, there aren't really many bright shots in here, but I was looking at a lot of architecture of the same era, and I was thinking about what looks like something has just happened, like what looks like something has just been staged, or you know, a drama's just happened or departed. And again, that comes back to I absolutely love, you know, Mike Leigh and that kind of cinema of improvisation.
And I suspect because the process for you is so important. There are many photographers who don't print their own works, which is fine, but there are many that do.
Yeah.
And color is so hard to do. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that you do this, but I guess you know your palette when you're
Yeah,
developing
yeah,
and what you like, and
it's
that's part of the control from you.
Yeah, but it's also the country I shoot has a palette as well. And I've been, you know, I do some architectural photography for clients every now and again, and they often say, you made it look like Italy the way you shoot it. And I guess again, it's that thing of like Ajay, like he imprinted himself on my camera, and I go out in the world and I sort of refined those compositions that have sort of never left me. Like, you know, like this sort of, like this, a lot of these, like this composition of a foreground and then something behind, I repeat all the time. That's often kind of happening, something kind of blocking, or like through that room, the work above the radiator, which is Roma. There's that foreground hiding, and then there's something behind that you can't see. And I think he did that a lot, that kind of wandering view as well.
But there's this tension in your work, like something has just happened or is about to happen. It's that moment where, like, you know, what have you taken a breath from or about to release and exhale? And I personally find a lot of common ground with Luigi Ghiri, who was heavily influenced as well by fiction, and that tension between fiction and reality.
Yeah, and was an amazing writer as well. Yeah, in a much more playful way that I think I am, perhaps. I think I'm not as sort of... But again, that's confidence maybe with his practice.
Yeah, but in that sense of not just the novel, but theatre and playwriting, and then it goes back to sets. Yeah. And of course, well, most of these images, most of these photographs are physical places that are real, that live and breathe where they are. And then there are two red herrings, that are not real.
No, so this one on the right is a model of Venice, and this is a model of the back of a facade in Venice. So again, this series did start with that body of work, I shot those in 2019. I spent a lot of time in this miniature Venice shooting this location, but I'm aware of like Thomas Demand and Gregory Crudson and Jeff Wall and these artists who have huge production scales building their sets. But again, I suddenly found it actually more interesting to shoot the real world, to look artificial. That became more exciting to me. And I was watching the HBO series of My Brilliant Friend, which is based on Eleanor Ferrante novels, and it's set in a really rundown area of Naples. And then I found out that the art director based the set on Guernica by Picasso. And I was like, okay, that changes everything. That's so interesting. And there's a work in there that I shot of a 1940s back of a sort of social housing building that felt so cardboard and set-like and plasterboard-like. So,
and you like
so it became more interesting.
Yeah,
But I put these in because you might not know. I think I could have gone quite obvious with some of them where you can see their sets. And this is a crop. This is like 30% of the image, and I quite like cropping in because it creates an ambiguity, and also it's this feeling of when I've shot my work, I'm still finding it in the work, and I love doing that. And that came out of lockdown as well, not being able to shoot any new work, cropping into what I'd already shot and trying to find something I'd missed, which I think we all did a lot of.
And even though there are no people in the works, I think I think that most artists' work is the work they put out are self-portraits in a way. And I know we've talked about this sort of, and I know you've talked about this with other people about being outside but very interior in yourself.
Yeah.
And that's sort of finding those quiet moments even though you're in big public spaces.
Exactly, yeah. They're like these places aren't quiet, they're often full of people and quite busy, but it is that also, you know, going to these places that are very recognizable or known and seeing what I find, it's always kind of different. Like I went to Tomba Brion by Carla Scarpa, who's an architect I don't actually like that much, but now that's on record. I find him very heavy, but anyway, I won't go down that road. But I arrived and it was like, you know, I've seen so many pictures of this cemetery that he designed just outside Venice, and I've seen one idea of it, and then when you get there, it's in this field, and it looks like giant Toblerones all kind of stacked around, or something out of like a Steven Spielberg novel. It's so sci-fi-y. Yeah. So it's always interesting. When you go, you find something that you haven't seen before, and that's an interesting challenge as well, especially with somewhere like Venice, because the idea of having 3 months there and shooting a project was just, you know, where do you start?
And these cities that have been so photographed, and have such a deep historical place in art, the broad sense, but also photographically as well. No, it's true, but I guess again that's the beauty of film and the light on the day you're shooting. You're always going to find something that hasn't been shot before, which is it's a strange confidence of kind of shooting and not knowing and keeping going. Yes, and not being able to see what you're making as you're going along. And
so blind.
That
must
be a real sort of leap of faith, because you do your homework and you know where you want to go, but you don't see the results until sometime later.
Yeah, you've got that precious cargo going home with you.
Which is great. I mean, there's a place for digital photography, of course. I love film. And I love that, it seems more spontaneous, because of course with digital, you can look in your viewfinder and go, delete, and make those edits that, whilst that's the truth,
you're self-editing while you're still going, while you're still creating. So film doesn't allow you to do that, which I love. All the edits happen later. So whatever you take, you're immediately thinking of the next shot. With digital, you're looking straight back. So that's a really different process as well. And it's, and I use a very cropped lens on both my cameras. So these are a medium of using my old camera and then a slightly larger format. But the lens is really cropped. So when I'm looking through it, I'm not seeing how I see. I'm seeing in a really reduced way, which changes everything as well. So I mean, I am intentionally kind of going in with a lot of them.
Which they are. They're very sort of narrow, the focus, and they're just really, really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
And I love that, as we've discussed, that link and influence of literature, of film, and it's
and also those kind of again, I've called it stills as well, because looking at cinema, I'm always taking screenshots of stills and moments in the kind of films, because they are also kind of carefully composed, and they are carefully composed to hold a narrative. So when I started this series, I was cropping into my work and kind of layering it. And I did actually make a film set around Soho with a lot of that work. I kind of came in and out of Soho during lockdown when it was completely deserted and really shocking. And a bit like La Jetée, where it's just a black and white film of 35mm images, and then with the soundtrack over the top. So I was doing something like that. So I have dabbled in film, but...
Is that something you're moving more into?
Maybe in like 10 years. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I don't know that I'm a storyteller. It's so hard. You know, storytelling is so hard. And I like setting the scene for it. So maybe in years to come, I will find the story that I want to tell, but not yet.
I feel like you are, because you love literature and the novel and that constructed story. And the films.
Yeah, but they're always autobiographical, you know, so that's always the jumping off point. So, you know, I love Ray Bradbury, who wrote like science fiction, but in a very literary way. And what he did with that genre was incredible and strange. So I'd like to be strange, and I don't know.
And this show, Stills, is on until
30th of July.
30th of July.
Yeah, and it's been great to show it here. And you know, this building has a huge history in the cinema industry, as does this whole kind of area. And it was amazing to curate it up here with the views and this kind of attic architectural feeling as well, because a lot of my work is very private and small, so something about the top floor space feels very private and secretive, and you're seeing views of the city that you don't normally see. So like I was, this was my curating this with the kind of architectural rooftop details was.
I mean, that is a theme, and that's a feeling in your work.
Yeah.
Again, that we're in these very public spaces, but they're very private moments.
Yeah. It's a way of me feeling private as well. It's like, how can I navigate being in these public places that I also don't want to be in,
Which
surrounded by people?
I feel like they are a self-portrait of sorts, even though there are no...
Yeah. No, it's all there. And I'm often on my own. That's when I shoot the best, is when I'm kind of, I can go down an alleyway and not explain why I want to go down there. It's sort of, yeah.
Yeah, and mostly, of course, shot in the day.
Yeah. I haven't done too much night photography. But yeah, I'm always using available light. So it's...
Again, back to, neo-realist cinema.
Yeah.
And that idea of using what you have
I know,
in front of you.
It's so much more exciting, for me anyway. I love doing that, and it's... Like there was one film, I think Rossellini's Roma Open Città, where he was filming and the guy came along to break up a fight. And he was like, no, we're on camera here. And the camera was so discreet and small, it's so low budget, but it was just that really intense realism feeling of...
Yeah.
And... and a bit like sort of Primo Levi, who wrote straight after the war, and it was quite rejected because it was too soon. They were shooting so soon, and a lot of those films were, kind of, what's the word, condemned by the church and everything, and like the one of the murdering of the priest, and but the immediacy of it was just like, just go.
Yeah, and
I
they
love
showed
that.
these real, these scenes and these streets that real people lived on, not the glamour of the classical architecture, Renaissance that most people think of.
Yeah, I guess that's a process of slowing down spaces as well and just sitting in them. Even though I work quite quickly and intuitively, there is that moment of like looking slowly and calmly.
And that contemplation. I definitely get that feeling and sense when I'm looking at these works, along with that tension of, what's just happened, what's about to happen. But it's a really, very private feeling.
So we're locked away out in the world.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? I think I've covered quite a few things we intended to, but if anyone's got any questions about individual works or anything, go ahead. Yeah.
So you mentioned atonement.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of James Bugari's cinematography.
Yeah.
And he's got a very specific palette. For me, I think your work, the natural progression is actually towards cinematography, because you set the scene. You also have a very strong palette, very distinct palette.
Yeah.
I think you did do something.
I did, yeah. And I also shot another film with my grandparents' house just after they passed away, because it was a sort of duality of Italian, British culture under one roof. Like a grandfather who was very obsessed with the English country house, and then, a grandmother who was born in Sardinia, then kind of moved up to the country in the north. So it was a combination of those things. So it was again, I haven't shown it.
You're a storyteller, but I think you're a really good storyteller.
All right.
I think that your English
Thank you.
background combination with Royal College MA is a fantastic combination.
Okay,
I
cool.
agree
Let's see.
with Brandei. I think you might want to be a DOP on a film or something.
Let it be known.
Yeah.
Let's do
put
it.
Out there.
Yeah.
I can see it. I
Cool.
can see it.
Yeah.
And
I think that my main fear with that is the collaborative element. I'm a very collaborative person, but when it comes to my artwork, I am locked down on my own.
Yeah.
So that's just a mindset change. It's a different thing. So I can shoot with other people. It's not impossible, but it's like being it's like being on your own in the studio. And from knowing painters, the sort of horror of someone else being in there watching them paint someone else or something like that. That's sort of how I feel a little bit. Yeah. So maybe I'll learn to be more collaborative artistically. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question/comment, which was, when I look at your work, and I think this ties into what you're saying about the idea of like something has just happened or about to happen.
Yeah.
That they're so quiet, and I think like that. I was trying, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, is that because there are no people? And I don't think it's only the fact that there's no people, but there's almost like very minimal evidence of life in terms of any kind of movement or sound. crumbs on the floor or something that would move in the wind or something like that. And I wonder if you could talk about that as like an aesthetic decision, or if it's something you're aware of, or it's more natural.
Well, I think that's also kind of why I started making film, because I missed the sound, and I thought the sound was so important to a lot of these locations, but I didn't want the moving image. So hence La Jetée reference and that idea. But I think I do look for scenes that are sort of slightly clean, because again I want to flatten everything. I want that ambiguity of scale to be a really important part of some of the work. So I think that's why I stray away from like detritus or movement.
And I think that artificiality you talked about, that play on something potentially being like real or unreal.
Yeah, and like the work behind you there, that was a corner of a library, and someone came in the other day and saw Fritz Lang's Metropolis in it, which I love, because I feel like that could be like Valhalla. That could be an enormous hallway. You're kind of not sure, but I think actually it is sort of one-to-one to scale. So that, and I guess because I print quite small as well, so I'm trying to throw all of that detail away to print something quite small that it could be quite monumental or not.
And by using natural light and not artificial light, I was really struck by this one, because it is just of the light.
Yeah, and on that terrazzo floor in Venice, which literally undulated. It was like a wave, that room. It was so, undulating from the humidity and movement, and the room bowed, but it was sort of,
I feel so much in this from just, like, I was trying to describe it to a friend. I said, well, it's light. It's,
but that's all it is. When it comes down to analog photography, you are just photographing light, and it is the great subject. I do quite like days that are kind of diffused and overcast, because then you kind of lose a sense of the horizon and scale. But fundamentally, and with that light as well, you've got to work out which point you're exposing it to. And I always like to burn out the areas around the light, so it becomes quite sculptural, and those other areas become quite mysterious.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one, Isabelle.
Go ahead.
So in your little journey, walking around in Venice or in LA, in very busy setups, how do you isolate that? How do you get into that quietness and catch up photographs and moments which are super still? How do you actually overlay those two timelines of so much noise and then stillness?
It's just so intuitive. It's sort of it's an instinctive thing. It's a way of kind of being alone. It's just I don't know. It's very natural. It's kind of, I'm often waiting for people to kind of move out of the way a little bit. I hate being looked at when I'm photographing something. It's my biggest fear. I don't like being observed, and that's why I photograph architecture. Not people. So it's never silence.
Just silent, but you've got all this.
Even when I'm at home editing, just silence. Because there's so much going on up here, I guess, but it's not actually going. Maybe it's not even going on. It's more muscles are reacting, and the camera is reacting. It's an extension of your body. So I'm thinking, but also just shooting. And it's often when you walk into a room, it's the first picture you see is the one. Sometimes I take 2 and 3 of a composition, but very rarely. And if I do, it's always the first one. So I guess it's.
It's like a meditative state.
Yes, exactly. That's
Like
hypnosis. Totally meditative. Yeah.
I just think it's interesting, because if someone was following you
Yeah.
with a camera, and then in the middle of so much noise, and then let someone see what you photographed, it's different.
Yeah.
Space.
I guess that's a challenge, and that's the fun. It's like you're a detective. You're on your hands and knees looking for clues and.
I think it puts outside of the frame around you when you're taking it as well.
Yeah.
Like, there's that stillness and then there's a whole light.
Yeah. Like this work, I was really, this was kind of up a staircase, and I loved that negative space of the yellow and leaving all that. So that was quite closely cropped, and then similar with this piece as well. There's a hint at lots going on around them, and again, that's really that composition I was talking about the blocks of the view and then something hiding behind it. Well, thank you all so much. If you haven't got any more.
I have one.
Okay, go for it.
Can we ask? I hate asking this, but I'm so curious. What's next?
I
we still have 2 weeks to enjoy this. But what's
I am curating a group show about painting and photography and how one has influenced the other. So details to follow. But it's something I really think about, and we've talked about it a lot, as being a photographer in the art world. and the sort of lack of crossover that happens kind of sometimes, or how much painting is inspired by photography,
Totally.
and how kind of often doesn't kind of want to admit that. But then when you look back into the history of art, like you know, like Cézanne and Degas,
Totally.
they were all looking at photography
Yeah.
and how photography changed the subject matter to something quite mundane,
Yeah.
and the snapshot,
And
cropping,
how much
and
photography, would painting have evolved in the way it did
Yeah, yeah.
had photography
Yeah.
not been
exactly,
invented?
exactly,
Because it challenged
Yeah.
painters to
yeah.
create work in a completely different way.
Yeah, no, I was, there's an amazing quote that I was reading this book about a photography exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the 80s, and the curator said, that photography was not a bastard left by science on the doorstep of art, but a legitimate child of the Western pictorial tradition.
Yeah.
I love that my
Yeah.
art is a bastard left by science, like it's like great.
And then how many artists who, if you think Man Ray,
Yeah,
actually thought of himself as a painter.
yeah, exactly,
He's
yeah.
known as a photographer now, but painting was part of his, photography
Yeah.
was part of his practice,
Yeah.
and then because of the war and him traveling became his means to have a living, because
Yeah.
he didn't make any money as a painter.
And also like painters who've based their works on photographers as well. So some photographers have existed as the source material for other works, yet that
Yeah.
source material hasn't had as greater attention.
Yeah. And
So
then you
that's-
think of people like Brancusi, who a
Yeah.
sculptor, and didn't let anyone photograph his work in his
Yeah,
studio except
I love
for himself.
that. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how sculptural and beautiful these photographs are. And I've sold many Brancusis for a lot of money, but I tell you, 20 years ago, people weren't collectors, were not looking at the work in the same way,
Right.
giving it that same importance.
Yeah.
And how, yes, it was part of his practice, and but how lovely it is to see that that's its own artwork, and that it's getting the recognition
Yeah.
alongside his sculptural
Yeah,
practice.
absolutely. And then there's also artists that, shoot their own photographs as source material, but will never show that. And I love that as well. That kind of, you need to protect that, because the painting is the artwork, but it kind of how it feeds into that as well.
And
So
then,
that's next.
I mean, we could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah,
but
yeah, we better.
But an artist who there are a number of great photographers working now who really work in collage
Yeah.
more, and,
Yeah.
and use source material that's not theirs.
Yeah.
But they are trained photographers.
Yeah, it's just that fluidity
Yeah.
between the mediums, and they borrow and steal from each other and influence each other, and I kind of want to just expose that conversation a bit more. So
100%.
let's,
And what I hope we've talked about here,
Yeah.
also the other influences, film, literature,
yeah,
and how it's all sort of,
Yeah.
it's all in the same
yeah.
minestrone
Yeah, I somehow
pot.
forgot to mention that I love painting. I sort of forgot to mention
Yeah.
that as a huge influence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that looseness and that mystery and, I don't know, that
Well,
kind of
I think you
uncertainty. But
achieved
anyway,
all of
Yeah.
that really, really well,
Thank
beautifully.
you.
And I've said this to you before, I find the work very mature for someone so young. So I'm really excited
Thank
to
you.
see
yeah.
what else you will do in the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, do grab a beer. Stick around. There's drinks nice and
Ask
chilled here.
questions, and to say these are all for sale. So
Yeah.
you can't leave without buying one.
You heard it from Brandei. Yeah. Thank you all so much. Thank you. It was great. Thank you. I feel like I left out so much.
No,
I suddenly was
no,
like,
I think.
but we just rolled.